So too many times I've had landlords come into my office and tell me that they want to get rid of a tenant because they found out well after the fact that they were lied to in their application. And while yeah, there are mechanisms to evict tenants who lie in their applications, there's a lot of telltale signs that you should look out for. And the next time you're digging through a set of applications for that next great tenant, you're going to want to look for these signs as a way to weed out the ones who are not exactly truthful. Let's get started. So I want to share with you 5 things that you can look out for that kind of reveal to you that your applicant probably isn't telling the truth in their application. And while it's true that there's no one way to absolutely know for sure, I can tell you that over the last 15 years, these scenarios have been where less than honest applicants have snuck their way onto property that they just didn't belong in. And the landlord or the property manager who evaluated their application simply did not know that what they were seeing was fictitious. And so I want you to consider these 5 things, again, not as an absolute, but to ask a few more questions when you're faced with any of these scenarios to make sure that the person in front of you is in fact authentic. One of the issues that you should always consider is the fact that you've never ever seen the tenant. If you have an application in front of you and you've never actually physically seen the applicant, that should be a red flag. It's not enough to just get a scanned copy of an ID. I always tell landlords and property managers that you're going to want to take a look at a physical copy of an ID and compare it with the person who's in front of you. Because if you're not actually certain that the person who they claim they are is who they are, at least to some reasonable extent, I don't know that it's a safe idea for you to sign over that house to them and hand over those keys. If the first transaction between you and them is based on a lie, that's a bad transaction. And you're going to want to pass on someone who you can't properly identify. Another thing to look for is when the person who's signing the lease is never actually around. It's always a friend or a family member who shows up in their place. Even sometimes just their realtor. Someone else shows up in their place and you never get an opportunity because they're always so busy. This even extends into the lease. I've had clients tell me they never met them before the application was filled out, they never met them at the time of lease signing, and they never met them after the lease was signed and they allegedly moved in. Every time they go visit the house, they're at work or they're gone or they simply cannot be found, but somebody else is always living there. You talk to the neighbors and they have no concept of the person who signed the lease, but they know the occupants very well. These are bad signs that, again, could have been found out in the application process. Another matter that gets landlords all the time is the super rush. Maybe you don't have time to meet the actual person because they are in such a hurry that we need to close this deal today. They've got all the money required. They've got the full deposit. They've got a full month's rent and they're ready to get in today. And you, because the money is there, overlook the need to do a thorough background check on this person. You've never seen them before. You sign a document, submit it online, maybe DocuSign everything. And again, without ever meeting the person because they're in such a rush, you get stuck with a bad tenant. In other cases where you've actually done your homework and you've actually done a background check, you get a number of dings. But for every single one of them, this prospective tenant has an extensive and elaborate explanation. If it's a matter of work documents that simply can't be produced, they're missing, this person can never show up with actual work documents. It's never their fault. It's always the employer. Oh, my employer this or my employer that, or they changed management companies, or for some reason, they simply cannot produce these documents for you to review before you need to make a decision. Again, whether or not these are legitimate, unfortunately, unless you can authenticate what they're saying about their employment, it's probably not a good idea to accept them as a tenant. And certainly if they have some elaborate excuse where absolutely no document can be produced to prove that they work where they say they work, may not be true. Another document that you're going to want to review is their state issued ID. Sometimes they're going to say, well, I just moved here, so I don't have a current ID. Well, they should have an ID from wherever it was they came. And you're going to want to see that. And if you're unable to see it because, oh, well, I got rid of it, of course, I didn't need it anymore. Well, that's not exactly true. They should always have some valid form of ID. But if they say they lost it, or they say they recently moved, or they conveniently keep forgetting it, that's a telltale sign that either they don't have it or they're not the person they say that they are. And then finally, if you have to get explained away the reason that there's a low credit score, or the fact that the eviction that's on their eviction history isn't really an eviction, or that the criminal record that you see probably belongs to someone else and there must be some mix-up. Again, these elaborate explanations, or the fact that what you see in a report isn't actually true because they've got a story that explains it, it sounds a bit fantastical. And again, I'm not saying that in all situations you're going to have someone who's not telling the truth, but these are scenarios where people have told stories that end up later being identified as false. You know, the application process can be tricky and sometimes it trips us up. I hope you're definitely employing an application process in your landlording. Additionally, I hope you are clicking below and letting me know that you like this content. If you have comments or questions for me, leave those below. And if you haven't yet subscribed, of course, I appreciate that. Now, again, let's say you've got an application and you've requested references, but you don't get a callback from anybody. Well, one easy way where you're not getting callbacks, and it's quite explainable, is because the applicant simply forgot to put any. That's just not good enough. If you're requiring some kind of reference and they forget or didn't fill it out and don't have time to do it now, if someone simply doesn't have good references, that's a bad sign. They should have someone who could vouch for them, and if they don't, you probably shouldn't be the first person to take a risk. If every number you call that's listed on an application gets a doo-doo-doo, we're sorry message that the number is no longer in service, that is a terrible sign. Now, they may claim, maybe I forgot, or maybe I wrote it down wrong, but that's too convenient of a story. If not a single reference can be confirmed, again, problem, you're gonna pass on this one. And then finally, you leave voicemails because you do get a number that is in service, but the voicemail message that's there for the person you called gives you no indication to authenticate who they are. You're looking for John Smith and you call and you get a generic voicemail that doesn't confirm that you're at least leaving a message for John Smith. And of course, you never get a call back. And so you can't confirm the things that are in the application, and it's probably because they just aren't correct. Now, what about that current landlord? If you are doing your due diligence and you are calling a current landlord and asking questions about the tenant and their current tenancy, but the landlord says very little, that's a terrible sign. One obvious reason that that person would say very little about the tenant or specifics about the tenancy is because it's not the actual landlord. You've been given a false name with no details that can be used. And so if you're gonna ask common questions about what it was like for that tenant to be on the property and you get answers that make little to no sense, it's probably because this person really isn't the landlord. They're playing a part and they're playing it badly. However, another time when a landlord might be silent or might give very little information is if either A, this landlord is so sick and tired of this tenant that they'll do whatever it takes, including not reveal all of the bad stuff this tenant has done so that they can get rid of them. That's a bad sign for you. If the landlord isn't spilling the beans because maybe he just doesn't want to say bad things about a bad tenant, that's one thing. But sometimes it's because the landlord and the tenant have entered into a settlement agreement. Often when parties enter into eviction cases, they're willing to sign what's called a non-disparagement clause in their settlement agreement because it gets that person out faster. And so if you have an occasion where you're calling a current landlord who says very little about the tenant, they might say the start date of the lease, the termination date of the lease and the amount of rent, and that is it. They give you no other specifics. That's an indication that there might be a settlement agreement in place that doesn't allow them to say anything except those basic facts. If that's the case, that's a bad sign that your tenant is withholding some big information that they really should have disclosed to you. But of course, if they had, you would have passed on them. You might think of passing on them when you figure out you're just not getting the information you need from their current landlord. And finally, you're going through the application, but none of the information in that document, or at least some of the bigger parts of it, simply cannot be independently confirmed. I tell landlords and property managers this all the time. You can't just take their word for it. The fact that they say that they work at 123 global industries and they give you a phone number doesn't necessarily mean A, that 123 global industries even exists, or B, that if they do exist, that the number that you got is the actual person or the actual company that you want to speak to in order to confirm employment history, and the amount of money this person makes. Certainly, if you do your own Google research and discover that this company either doesn't exist or exists, but the numbers are different, and you call and there's no record of the applicant, clear sign you're being lied to. But that's not the only way. Perhaps the information they give you helps you in no way to secure a credit report. Or they tell you, well, I don't have a social security number. Now, that in and of itself is not necessarily indication that they're a bad tenant. But if you can't confirm the creditworthiness of an individual, you might find that to be just one of those non-starters. And if that's in your criteria, that you must be able to confirm someone's credit score or their credit worthiness, and you can't do it, then you probably got to pass. And the last one is that the applicant is self-employed, and they're trying to convince you that there's no way for them to confirm their employment history or their yearly salary, except maybe with a letter or just their oral pronouncement of how much money they make and how long they've made that kind of money. But the truth is, tax statements can be produced, and there are ways to indicate exactly how much money a person makes. Now, if they claim they make $200,000 a year, but their tax statements reflect something different, and they may tell you, well, I don't exactly report it all to the IRS, who does? Well, they're just telling you not only that they're committing tax fraud, but they're also telling you they don't tell the truth. And this is a big red flag that you should take seriously and then pass on this particular applicant. You want to make sure that when you are reviewing applicants, that you're taking every reasonable step to make sure you've got the right applicant in place for you. For additional content on this channel, we welcome you to check out whatever it is that YouTube is saying is perfect for you. We've got a video right here and a ton of other videos for you on the channel. We hope you enjoy them, and until next time, landlords, happy leasing.